My grandfather never talked much about the cabin. That was the thing about him. He was a man who showed you instead of told you. He'd press a key into your hand or point to something on a map before he'd ever sit down and explain it. So when the lawyer called and said the property on Sycamore Ridge Road was mine, I wasn't entirely surprised. I was just sorry I hadn't understood sooner what he'd been trying to show me all those years. His name was Earl Maddox. He'd built the cabin in 1981 with 2 friends and a borrowed truck, hauling lumber up a gravel road that barely deserved the name. I know this because my mother told me, and because there are photographs, actual printed photographs in a shoebox, of 3 men in flannel shirts squinting into the sun with hammers in their hands, and the kind of pride on their faces that doesn't need a caption. He bought out his friend's shares over the following decade. By 1993, it was his alone. By the time I was old enough to visit, it already felt ancient, solid, like it had always been there and always would be. I'd spent summers there as a kid. The smell of the place is still the first thing that comes back when I think about it. Pine and something faintly metallic, like the cold air off the ridge had a mineral quality you couldn't find anywhere else. There was a covered porch that ran the full length of the front face, and he kept 2 rocking chairs out there regardless of the season. We'd sit in them after dinner, and he wouldn't say much. And I learned early that silence with Earl wasn't absence. It was just how he rested. He passed in October, quietly, the way he'd done most things. I got the call on a Tuesday and drove out for the service on a Thursday and stood at the edge of a small crowd of people who had known him longer than I had and probably missed him more than they were letting on. The lawyer found me at the reception and handed me a card and said to call when I was ready. I wasn't ready for about 6 weeks. Then I called. The cabin sat on just under 2 acres. There was the main structure, 3 rooms, a sleeping loft, a wood stove that had been converted to gas sometime in the 90s, and a storage shed out back, and a fence along the eastern property line that Earl had put up himself sometime in the early 2000s. The whole property was paid off. No mortgage, no lien, nothing. It was mine free and clear, the lawyer said. And he said it the way lawyers sometimes say things that sound too good, like he was bracing for me to disbelieve him. I drove up the following weekend with 2 bags and a cooler, and the kind of cautious optimism you feel when something good happens and you haven't figured out yet what it's going to cost you. The road had been paved since I was a kid. The neighborhood around the cabin had filled in, houses where there used to be empty lots, a small cluster of mailboxes at the end of the lane that hadn't been there before. The area had organized itself in the years since my grandfather was building his fence and arguing with no one. There was a sign at the entrance now. Sycamore Ridge Community Association. Beneath it, smaller, a notice about approved exterior colors and trash receptacle placement. I didn't think much about the sign that first evening. I sat in one of the rocking chairs on the porch and watched the light change on the tree line and ate a sandwich and thought about Earl and about how a man could spend 40 years making something solid and then hand it to someone else and trust them to understand what they were holding. I think I understood. I was learning anyway. She came on the 3rd day. I remember because I was still figuring out the coffee maker, an old percolator my grandfather had used for 30 years, and I'd just gotten it to produce something drinkable when I heard the knock. Not a timid knock, a knock that announced itself. I opened the door and there she was. Late 50s, maybe early 60s, with the kind of posture that comes from decades of being the most important person in whatever room she occupies. Her hair was set like she had somewhere to be afterward, and she was holding a clipboard the way some people hold a badge. She was smiling, but the smile was a tool, not a feeling. "You must be the new owner," she said, making it sound like both a greeting and an accusation. "I'm Diane Marsh. I'm the president of the Pinecrest Homeowners Association, and I want to be the first to officially welcome you to the community." I thanked her and waited. She tilted the clipboard toward me and slid a single sheet of paper from beneath the metal clamp, holding it out between 2 fingers like a summons. I also wanted to make sure you were aware of a few existing concerns with the property. Nothing that can't be addressed, of course. We just like to get ahead of these things. I took the paper and read it standing in the doorway. It was a formal notice, actual HOA letterhead, her signature at the bottom, listing what it called documented violations. The exterior paint on the north-facing wall was described as deteriorated and non-compliant with community standards. There was a garden shed behind the main structure noted as unapproved and potentially non-conforming. And there was a fence along the eastern property line that was flagged as exceeding the maximum height by approximately 2 inches. 2 inches. I looked up from the paper. She was still smiling. My grandfather built that shed, I said. I understand, and these things do tend to accumulate over time when a property isn't being actively managed. She said it gently, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis they've clearly enjoyed arriving at. We sent notices to the estate, of course, but naturally things get complicated during probate. We completely understand. This is really just a courtesy, so you know where things stand. I thanked her again. I told her I'd look everything over. She handed me a second sheet, a timeline for remediation, with specific deadlines and dollar amounts attached to each item if left unresolved, and told me the board met the second Tuesday of every month if I had questions. Then she looked past me into the cabin. Not a glance, a look, the kind of slow appraising survey you do when you're pricing something. It's a wonderful structure, she said. Really. The bones are incredible. Properties like this don't come available very often in a neighborhood like ours. She paused just long enough. Such a shame about the location issues. I asked her what she meant by location issues. She pulled the smile back just slightly, like she hadn't meant to say it. Oh, it's probably nothing to worry about right now. There have just been some long-standing questions about the original property survey in this part of the development. Old records, you know how it is. I'm sure it'll all be sorted out. She clicked her pen once, capped it, and tucked it into the clipboard spine. We'll be in touch. She walked back down the porch steps without hurrying, got into a white sedan parked at the curb, sat there for a moment before she drove away. I stood in the doorway holding 2 pieces of paper and a cup of mediocre coffee, watching her go, with that last line sitting in my chest like something had been set down and not yet picked back up. Location issues. I went back inside and looked at the percolator. Then I looked up at the attic door. The second notice arrived on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because I had just gotten back from the hardware store with a new box of weather stripping, and I remember thinking I'd finally have a quiet afternoon to work on the back door. The envelope was tucked between the storm door and the frame. No stamp, hand-delivered. The return address was just a logo, a little oak tree inside a circle, with the letters HOA beneath it, like a brand. I set my bag down on the porch steps and opened it right there. Unapproved exterior modification. The garden shed again. This time they had attached a grainy photograph taken from what looked like the road. The shed barely visible through the tree line, and beneath it a citation number and a fine, $80, payable within 30 days. I went inside and put it on the kitchen table next to the first one. The first had come 6 days after Diane's visit. That one was about the fence. Formal now, typed on official HOA letterhead, referencing a specific section of the community covenants I had never been given a copy of. It cited the height regulation and informed me I was in violation and that continued non-compliance could result in escalating fines and, eventually, a lien against the property. I had read that word, lien, and felt a small cold thing move through my chest. Not fear exactly, more like recognition, like understanding for the first time what she actually intended. The third notice came that Friday. This one was about the paint. By the end of the third week, I had 5 of them. The shed, the fence, the paint. Something about a downspout that allegedly directed water toward common drainage in a non-compliant manner, and one that was so vague it cited only a general maintenance standard and invited me to schedule a compliance inspection at my earliest convenience. Each one had a different citation number. Each one had a fine attached. I started a folder. That probably sounds like I had a plan from the beginning, and I want to be honest, I didn't. I wasn't playing chess. I was just doing what my grandfather had always done, which was keep paper. He believed that if something was worth doing, it was worth writing down, and if something was written down, it was worth filing. There were folders in that fireproof box going back to 1987. Utility easement agreements, permit applications, inspection reports, a handwritten note from the county assessor's office, dated 1991, confirming the property boundary after a neighbor dispute that had apparently resolved itself before it ever became anything serious. I kept paper because he kept paper. That's all it was. So I made a folder, and I put the notices in it in order, and I wrote the date received on the top corner of each one in pencil. And then I called my cousin Rena, who had gone to law school and was now doing real estate work up in the city, and I told her what was happening. She listened without interrupting, which is rare for Rena. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Have you actually read the HOA covenants?" And I told her I had never been given a copy. She said they're required to provide them. I said nobody provided anything when I inherited the property. She said that's interesting. She asked me to scan and send her everything. The notices, whatever documents I had from the estate transfer, anything related to the property boundary. I told her about the fireproof box. Another pause. Then, how thorough was your grandfather? I looked around the kitchen, at the labeled shelves, the organized drawers, the little index card he had taped inside the cabinet door, listing which circuit breaker controlled which room. Pretty thorough, I said. Good, she said. Don't respond to any of the notices yet. Just keep collecting them. So that's what I did. I kept the folder, I kept my mouth shut, and I waited to see what Diane would send next. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. No knock, no doorbell, just a white envelope tucked under my windshield wiper like a parking ticket. I almost missed it entirely. I stood in the driveway and read it twice, then a third time, because the first two times I was certain I'd misunderstood something. The language was dense, full of phrases like encroachment upon common property and disputed boundary designation, but the meaning underneath all that careful wording was plain enough. Diane was claiming that a portion of the land the cabin sat on, specifically the northwest corner, which included the shed and about 15 feet of yard, belonged to the HOA common land, she called it. Shared community space that my grandfather had allegedly been using without authorization for years. There was a deadline at the bottom, 30 days to respond, or the association would pursue the matter through available legal channels. I folded the letter and went inside and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Here is what I want to be honest about. My first feeling was not outrage. It was something closer to doubt. I had inherited this property, not bought it. I hadn't sat across a table from anyone and signed anything. I hadn't done the research myself. For about 20 minutes, I sat there wondering if maybe, just maybe, there was something to this. Some old paperwork error. Some surveying dispute that predated my grandfather's time. Something I didn't know about, because I hadn't been there for the 40 years he had. That doubt lasted exactly as long as it took me to remember who we were talking about. This was Diane. Diane with the clipboard, and the smile that arrived before her eyes did. Diane who had sent me notices about paint peeling on a fence post and a garden shed that had been standing since before some of the neighbors were born. Diane who had, in the 3 weeks since I moved in, made it her particular project to make me feel like a guest in my own home. I thought about my grandfather. Not sentimentally, I thought about him specifically as a person. He was an engineer by trade and a careful man by nature. He kept his tax returns going back to 1987. He had a folder for every appliance warranty in the house, including 2 appliances that no longer existed. The man had labeled the breaker box in 3 colors. If there had been any question about this land, any question at all, he would have known about it. And if he had known about it, he would have handled it. And if he had handled it, there would be a record. I went upstairs. The attic was exactly what you'd expect from a man like him, organized in a way that only made complete sense once you understood his system. Banker's boxes, labeled by year and category. A metal shelving unit along the far wall. And there, in the corner near the window, where the light came through in the afternoon, the fireproof box, grey, solid, about the size of a carry-on bag. I remembered him mentioning it once, years ago, in the offhand way people mention things they consider obvious. "Everything important is in the box," he'd said. "You'll know where to find it." I lifted the lid. The original deed was right on top. Below it, 3 separate property surveys, one from the original purchase, one from a boundary dispute in 1994 that I'd never heard about, and one from 2003. Each one showing the same thing. Each one signed, notarized, and accompanied by the corresponding county records. I sat on the attic floor and read through all of it. Then I called an attorney. Not because I was scared. Not because I thought Diane had any ground to stand on. But because my grandfather had taught me, without ever saying it directly, that when someone comes for what's yours, you don't just know you're right. You make sure everyone else knows it too. The attic smelled like cedar and old paper and something else I couldn't name, something that belonged to my grandfather the way his flannel shirts did, the way his handwriting did. I had been up there twice since moving in, both times just to drag boxes toward the light and look inside them long enough to feel sad, then push them back. The third time I went up, I knew what I was looking for. He had mentioned the box exactly once, when I was maybe 12 years old, and we were sitting on the porch, watching a summer storm come in over the tree line. He pointed toward the roof line and said, without much ceremony, that everything that mattered about this property was in a green box in the attic, fireproof, waterproof, and organized better than anything else he'd ever done in his life. Then the storm arrived and we talked about something else, and I never thought about it again for 20-some years. It was in the far corner, tucked behind 2 broken chairs and a lamp with no shade. Green, like he said, about the size of a large dictionary. It had a combination lock on it that took me 4 tries to open because I kept second-guessing myself, kept thinking he would have chosen something other than his wedding anniversary. He wouldn't have. He wasn't that complicated. Inside, everything was in labeled manila folders, not handwritten labels, typed. He had typed them, which meant at some point he had fed individual manila folders into a typewriter with the care and patience of a man who understood that future people would need to read them under stress. The thought of him doing that made me stand very still for a moment. There was the original deed to the property, recorded with the county in 1981, with the legal description laid out in the dry, specific language that deeds use. Meets and bounds, reference points, distances measured in feet. There was a survey from 1983 signed and stamped by a licensed surveyor, showing every boundary line in clean black ink. There was a second survey from 1997. Same surveyor, same conclusions, apparently done when a neighbor had questioned the eastern property line. There was documentation showing that question had been resolved, in my grandfather's favor, without argument. There was a folder labeled HOA. Inside it was the original CC and RS from when the Homeowners Association was first established. A document that was 31 pages long and had clearly been read more than once. There were notes in the margins, in pencil, in his handwriting. Not angry notes, careful ones. The kind a person makes when they are paying attention and want to remember what they noticed. I sat on an overturned crate and read for a long time. What I found slowly and then all at once was that my grandfather had been a thorough man in ways that went beyond just keeping records. He had understood that owning something wasn't only about having the thing, it was about being able to prove you had it, in language that left no room for interpretation, backed by signatures and stamps and dates that nobody could argue with. He had done all of that. Every line was clean. Every boundary was documented. Every relevant question had been asked and answered before I was old enough to ask it myself. By the time I climbed back down the attic stairs, the green box tucked under my arm, I had stopped feeling the way I'd been feeling since Diane's last visit. The low, grinding anxiety that had been sitting behind my sternum for weeks. The one that whispers, maybe they're right. Maybe you don't actually know. Maybe you should just go quietly. That was gone. I set the box on the kitchen table and called my attorney. She was quiet while I described what I had. Then she said, "Bring me everything." I did. The Saturday started quiet. That kind of still, cool morning where sound carries farther than it should, and you can hear a car door from 2 streets over. I was on the back porch with coffee when I heard her coming, not because she was subtle about it, but because Diane had never learned to be. 2 cars, her silver sedan, and a cruiser behind it. I set my mug down slow. I had known this was coming. Not the exact morning, not the exact hour, but I had known it was coming. The same way you know a storm is coming when the pressure in the air changes. The notices had stopped 2 weeks prior, which should have felt like relief but didn't. Diane going quiet was never a good sign. Diane going quiet meant she was loading up. I went inside and got the accordion folder from the kitchen table. I had moved it there 3 days ago from the attic, just in case. She knocked the way people knock when they want you to know they're serious about it. 4 hard raps, pause, then 3 more. I took a breath and opened the door. She had brought a young officer, maybe late 20s, with the slightly uncomfortable expression of a man who already suspected his morning was about to get complicated. He held his hat in front of him with both hands. Diane stood half a step ahead of him, like she was presenting him as evidence. "Mr. Callahan," she said, and the smile was gone now. Every pretense of neighborly courtesy stripped away. "Officer Reyes is here because this situation has gone on long enough. You are occupying HOA common property without authorization, and we are asking you to vacate." I looked at Officer Reyes. He gave me the smallest, most apologetic nod I have ever seen on a human face. "Can I show you something?" I said, directing it at him rather than her. I opened the folder on the porch railing. The original deed was on top, behind a plastic sleeve. My grandfather's name, the property address, the notary stamp, dated 43 years back. Behind that, the survey. Behind that, the letter from my attorney, which I had requested 2 weeks ago for exactly this purpose, and which stated in plain, unambiguous language that the property boundaries had been independently verified and that the land in question belonged to the estate, transferred to me by legal inheritance with no overlap onto any common area. Officer Reyes took the deed first. He read it carefully. He was not rushing. Diane started talking. She had her own papers, a printout of something from the HOA's management software, and she was explaining that the original survey was outdated, that a resurvey had been conducted, that the HOA's records showed a clear encroachment along the northern boundary. The officer looked up from the deed. "Do you have that resurvey on file with the county?" Diane's mouth opened, then closed. "Because this deed and the survey attached to it are county-recorded documents," he said, not unkindly. "If there's a competing survey, it would need to go through the same process to be legally recognized." He handed the papers back to me with both hands. "Mom," he said, turning to Diane, "this property clearly belongs to him. There's nothing I can do here. If the HOA believes there's a legitimate boundary dispute, that would need to go through civil court." What I remember most is not what her face did in the first second. It's what it did in the third and fourth seconds. When the first second had passed and the reality had settled and there was nothing left to reach for, the certainty drained out of her all at once, like someone had pulled a plug. She gathered her papers. She said something I didn't fully catch, something about this not being over. Officer Reyes and I stood on the porch, and watched her walk back to her car. He shook my hand before he left. The cruiser was still running when Officer Delgado came through the gate. I could hear the engine idling out on the street, patient and unhurried, which told me something about how seriously he expected this to go. Diane was 3 steps ahead of him, moving fast, already pointing at the cabin like she was showing a realtor a property she intended to buy. I was standing on the porch. I had been standing there for about 10 minutes actually, ever since I heard her car door slam. The fireproof box was open on the porch table behind me. I had not rushed. I had simply gone up to the attic, brought it down, and unlocked it. Then I made a cup of coffee and waited. Diane got to the porch steps first. Her voice had that quality it sometimes gets in people who have made a decision before they arrived somewhere. Tight, performative, meant for an audience even when the audience is only one tired police officer. "This is him," she said. "He's been squatting on HOA common land since March. I have documentation." Officer Delgado looked at me. He had the measured expression of a man who had been called to a great many Saturday morning disputes and had learned not to show what he was thinking until he needed to. "Sir," he said, "can you tell me your name and your connection to this property?" I told him my name. I told him my grandfather had built the cabin in 1981 and that I had inherited it 14 months ago when he passed. Then I stepped aside and gestured to the table. "I have the original deed," I said. "Recorded survey from 1983, updated again in 2004. A title search from when I refinanced the property last year, and a letter from my attorney that addresses the specific claim being made about the eastern boundary." I had arranged them in that order deliberately. The deed on top, clean and legible. My grandfather's name printed in the careful bureaucratic font of another era. Delgado picked it up. He read it the way people read things they are actually trying to understand rather than skim. Diane shifted her weight on the bottom step. "That document is outdated," she said. "The HOA bylaws from 2019 redrew the common area boundaries. I have the amended map." Delgado set the deed down and looked at her. "Do you have that map with you?" She pulled out her clipboard. The map she produced was a photocopy of a photocopy, slightly skewed from the scanner, the boundary lines thin and wavering. He held it next to my survey. He spent a long moment looking at both. "Ma'am," he said, "this map doesn't appear to be a recorded legal document. It doesn't have a county seal, no surveyor's signature, no recording number." He set it back on her clipboard with a kind of finality. "What you're describing, a boundary dispute, a property rights claim, that's a civil matter. It goes through the courts. I can't remove someone from a property they hold a recorded deed to based on an internal HOA document." He looked at me. "Sir, I don't have any basis to ask you to leave your property." Diane's voice went up a register. She said something about the board's authority, about precedent, about 3 other properties that had been reclaimed using the same process. Delgado listened, and I will give him credit. He listened completely, without interrupting. When she finished, he said, calmly, that none of what she described changed the legal standing of a recorded deed, and that if the HOA believed they had a valid claim, they were welcome to pursue it through civil court. Then he thanked us both for our time, walked back through the gate, and got into the cruiser. Diane stood at the bottom of my porch steps for a moment. She looked at the box, at the papers, at the cabin behind me like it had somehow done this to her personally. Then she walked to her car, and I went inside and finished my coffee. The shed is still standing. I want to start there, because that detail matters more to me than any of the rest of it. It's not a remarkable shed. Weathered grey wood, a rusted hinge on the left door that my grandfather never got around to fixing, a smell inside that is equal parts motor oil and old rope. He built it himself sometime in the late 70s, before the HOA existed, before this neighborhood had a name on a sign at the entrance, before any of this land had been carved up into jurisdictions and bylaws and enforcement schedules. He built it because he needed somewhere to put his tools. That was the whole reason. Diane wanted it gone. That was what I kept coming back to in the weeks after the Saturday she showed up with that officer. Not the deed dispute, not the fence, not the peeling paint on the north-facing eave. The shed. Something about the fact that she had looked at a structure my grandfather built with his own hands and decided it was a problem to be solved. That told me everything I needed to know about how she saw this property. Not as a place where a family had lived and worked and left something behind. As a liability. As a line item on a clipboard. The officer that morning had been professional about it. I want to be fair to him. He had clearly been told one version of events before he arrived, and to his credit, he adjusted quickly when presented with another. He looked at the deed. He looked at the survey. He looked at the letter from my attorney, which was not a threatening letter. It was simply a precise one, the kind that says, "Here is what is true, and here is how we know it." He handed everything back to me carefully, like he understood he was holding something that mattered. What he said to Diane, I've already told. What I remember more is what came after. The way she stood on the gravel drive for a moment, clipboard at her side, and I could see her recalculating. She was not a person accustomed to being wrong in front of an audience, even an audience of two. She said something about pursuing it through proper channels. The officer nodded in the patient way that people nod when they have somewhere else to be. She did pursue it, filed a formal grievance with the board, requested a special session, prepared what I was told was a fairly extensive presentation. I wasn't there for that meeting. I didn't need to be. 3 of the 5 board members had apparently been waiting for an excuse, and she handed them one by overclaiming in a situation where the documentation was airtight. I heard about the vote secondhand, from a neighbor 2 houses down who had watched the whole thing with visible satisfaction. She was not removed from the neighborhood. She still lives here. I see her occasionally, near the mailboxes or pulling out of her driveway. We do not speak. I don't have any particular feeling about that. What happened was not personal, even if she made it feel that way. What happened was that she believed she had more power than she did, and then she found out the limits of it. My grandfather never trusted that things would work out. He trusted that if you kept your records, you gave yourself a fighting chance. The fireproof box, the notarized surveys, the careful handwriting on every folder tab. That wasn't pessimism. That was love, extended forward in time, to someone he couldn't have known would need it. The cabin is still mine. The shed still smells like motor oil and old rope. The fence is still 2 inches too tall, and I have no plans to change that. Some things are worth keeping exactly as they are.